And then in January, my senior year, I was hospitalized for attempting to take my own life. And when I was hospitalized, I wasn't on anyone's radar. I was president of my class and involved in every single thing possible and had a high GPA and had this huge external life that everybody saw and an internal life that was completely different. So I thought when I got out of the hospital, like things would be pretty okay. Like people would be concerned and supportive. But when I got out of the hospital, I actually lost a couple of my close friends. And then the rumors just kind of started where, people were calling me psycho and crazy.
Dear Family is a podcast hosted by Rachel Steinman, a writer, an educator, and a mental health advocate. And Rachel gets us up close and personal, so we feel a strong connection, familiarity, and comfort with her guests. So settle in and join us as we search for true healing and journey with Rachel and her most interesting guests.
Hi, dear family and friends. Get ready for another inspirational and eye-opening story. Thank you so much for listening. And if you aren't already doing so, please subscribe and share, dear family. It means the world to me and makes all the difference. And if you want to continue and contribute to the conversations, please join my private Facebook group, Dear Family Members. You get to see secret photos and videos only Dear Family members are privy to, and you'll even have the opportunity to ask me and my guests questions directly. The link is in the show notes. I can't wait to see you there. To the outside world, Ross Szabo's life looked aspirational and picture perfect. He was the student body president of his high school, he played varsity basketball, and he volunteered for the Special Olympics and Students Against Drunk Driving. But on the inside, his world was quite different. He didn't dare tell anyone he was diagnosed as bipolar with anger and psychotic features when he was just 16 years old, mostly out of shame and pride. And he covered up his pain with alcohol abuse. But at 17, he was hospitalized for attempting to take his own life. Nearly 3 decades later, Ross is here today to talk about how he overcame obstacles to become a social innovator who pioneered the youth mental health movement. Ross is now the wellness director at Geffen Academy at UCLA, an author and an award-winning speaker who uses the power of his personal story to captivate his audience. He's also the CEO of Human Power Project, a company that designs mental health curriculum, and he's spoken to more than 2 million people about the importance of mental health by providing a positive example to empower them to seek help. Ross is the co-author of Behind Happy Faces, Taking Charge of Your Mental Health, and a blogger for the Huffington Post. Ross's mental health curriculum is being utilized by over 200,000 students with plans to reach many more. So, hi, Ross. I just want to let our listeners know that you're in your office at Geffen Academy at UCLA, so we might hear some students in the background, which would be great. I first heard your name from another parent when you came in to speak to her high school son at Harvard Westlake in Los Angeles. For those that don't know, Harvard Westlake has the reputation of being one of the top private schools, not just in Los Angeles, but in the country. But it's also known as one of the most stressful private high schools. And after the students filed into the auditorium and you began to speak, this is what I've heard, and I definitely believe it after watching your videos, you could hear a pin drop because you connected with every student by sharing your own personal story. So I immediately had to go home and Google you, and I watched many videos of you, and I am just so impressed and inspired by your speaking ability and just grateful for all that you're doing to encourage people to take care of their mental health and to rid stigma. So thank you for everything you're doing and also just for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. That's quite an introduction. It's always hard to be as impressive as that sounds.
Well, it is impressive to speak to all those kids, and I'm sure you really did touch them. So, of course, you know that this podcast is called Dear Family, and you say that every mental illness begins with a family. Can you tell us a little bit about why you say that and maybe a little bit about your journey and your family?
Yeah. And so the way that I always think about it is everyone's journey with mental health begins with a family. And, I think one of the most important things that resonates with me is as I look back at my first family photo, it's this amazing early 80s photo where my parents are wearing matching track jumpsuits with turtlenecks, and
Love that.
my mom has just let out her disco perm, and the family dog is looking at the camera, but my oldest brother isn't. And what I love about photos like that is we project so many emotions into the photos, and we all can think about our own first family photo and what it means to us. But when you look at those photos, you only get the stories that you project into it, and as I looked at my family photo, I realized like you'd never know that my father grew up in a home with a father who was a classic 1950s alcoholic and struggled with his own mental health issues, and that my mom grew up in a home with a mother who had mental health disorders. And so even before we have a chance to develop, we already come into a world that has this biological environmental combination that is going to shape us. And I think the most difficult thing about that is my parents did everything they could to make sure I didn't have the childhood they have, but they could never change the biological elements that were going to contribute to my emotional turmoil.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a minute, about the picture perfect on the outside. But So where did you grow up?
I was actually born in Bethlehem and raised in Nazareth, Pennsylvania.
Right. Right. Not the Middle East. Okay. So
Pennsylvania.
And Ross, you just alluded to the fact that your dad had alcoholism on his side and your mom had mental health issues on her side. So, clearly you were predisposed to not just the biology as you referred to, but the trauma. And then your brother ends up in a psych ward. Was that before or after you experienced your mental health issues?
It was before. I had a pretty typical normal childhood filled with like all kinds of joy. Around the age of 11, right after I turned 11, for the next year and a half, I went through a massive amount of loss and trauma. I visited my oldest brother in a psychiatric ward when I was 11.
Wow.
A couple months after that, my grandmother died. About 10 months after that, one of my best friends was killed in a car accident. And then about 2 or 3 months after that, my grandfather died. And that was all between the ages of like 11 and 12.
That is a lot of trauma to take in. I have to say, my best friend was also killed by a drunk driver when I was 16. And wow, that is very hard to get over. So clearly you had, this trauma, but when did you start noticing that you might be having some mental health issues?
Well, I think the original, and the reason I talk about the family piece of this is, I started coping by just hiding my emotions and drinking alcohol when I was, around 12 or 13. The symptoms of bipolar disorder didn't hit me until I was 16. And those symptoms were pretty just typical symptoms like mania, where I couldn't sleep for 4 or 5 days in a row, but I wasn't tired and my mind was just racing and I felt invincible, followed by serious bouts of depression where I couldn't get out of bed and had no energy and, just was really lethargic and didn't care what happened to me. And because my mind was just going through so many changes and so many issues, I started actually drinking more because it was the only way I could shut down. It was the only way I could numb out. And, the reason I talk about what I did when I was 12 and 13 is because the diagnosis of bipolar disorder that happened to me at 16 was important, but it wasn't nearly as critical as the coping skills that I had already developed from that loss and trauma when I was 11 and 12.
No, that's a good thing to point out also, because bipolar doesn't always come out as early as 11 or 12. So you kind of had this like groundwork where you had this very difficult things happen to you. And then you go and you visit your brother and your friend dies and all of these things that are so hard. And then you turn to alcohol to cope. And so that just only exasperates it, I'm sure. And you were self-medicating. And, I'm sure you've thought, God, how would things have been different had I not turned to alcohol and had someone kind of guiding me, right? Before you even hit those bipolar moments.
It's true. And with the biological elements of addiction, on being on both sides of my family, one of the bigger challenges for me was I didn't know that, when I was 12 and had my first time of getting drunk, that I was lighting up literally a slot machine of neural pathways that were far bigger than my life. That age of first use is so important. And I just didn't know. And when I look back at that time, I could have had someone to guide me. It's that, by the time I was 16 and became symptomatic of bipolar disorder, I was just lying about what was happening anyway.
Right. Again, back to kind of that shame that, we talk about that a lot on Dear Family about how, here you were on the outside, you kind of, and this was when you were about 16, you had this picture perfect high school life, right? You were class president, you played basketball on the varsity team, and you were involved in all these activities. But on the inside, you, out of shame, you didn't let anyone know that you were struggling. And, chances are your parents before you were in similar situations. Do you think that is because of shame? Do you think shame played a role in your kind of keeping to yourself?
Yeah. So what I was saying was I think part of it was shame for sure. I grew up in just such a blue collar small town and everyone always just muscled through everything. And I think a lot of the reasons I hid my emotions was pride. I think also while my parents did everything to make sure I didn't have the childhood they had, it's not like they grew up in homes where anyone ever talked about feelings either. So I didn't grow up in a home where we talked about emotion or knew what it was. So even at 16, when people would be like, how do you feel? I didn't even have the vocabulary to describe it. So there was a lot of anger and there was a lot of pride and there was a lot of shame. I can't say one was kind of stronger than the other.
No, I appreciate you saying that. I think also for men, it's sometimes even harder to talk about mental health issues because here you are, class president and playing basketball, and you don't want others to think that you can't handle your position or that you're weak.
Yeah. And the weakness piece was kind of huge in my hometown too. You muscle through things, you get through things, but you don't talk about it. You don't express it or tell anyone about it. Even my dad, he always told this story about how he didn't realize how many people knew his father was an alcoholic until after his father died, and people, wrote these kind of vague sympathy cards that were sorry for your loss, but that guy was kind of, not the best. And then it started hitting him where he was like, was my dad not the best? And kind of having his own emotions about it.
Right. And then also back to, kind of not talking about emotions. What happened when your brother went to a psych ward? I mean, you were only 11, so you might not remember, but
I think the one thing I remember the most is I had a neighborhood that was supportive of my brother. And I remember my parents and one of my neighbors explaining it as oh, well, Ross's brother is just lacking this kind of chemical in his brain, and they're just trying to help him get that chemical back. And it's kind of funny to think what sticks with you when you're in trauma and you're that young. And that is the one description that stuck with me. So I don't know that anybody was well, screw this kid, he's in a hospital. I think it was not talked about. And then I think, there were simplistic explanations, but nobody really focused on it that much.
Well, so then how, did you get a proper diagnosis as bipolar, or did it take you ending up in the psych or in the mental hospital for attempting to take your life to get a diagnosis?
I think the diagnosis when I was 16 was appropriate. I was diagnosed in the summer before my junior year of high school, and I was hospitalized in January of my senior year. So I had the diagnosis a year and a half before I was hospitalized.
Did your parents take you to a doctor for the diagnosis, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I was drinking so heavily,
Uh-huh.
and my middle brother saw everything I was doing, and he actually told a friend of the family, and the friend of the family was like, you're messed up. You got to get you some help. And so my parents actually set up the appointment at a psychiatrist who had been treating my oldest brother. That's what led to the diagnosis at 16.
Wow, that must have been so hard for your parents, to have two sons struggling. So you're diagnosed at 16. Did they give you any medication?
Yeah, the age of the 90s was like medicate everything, right? And
Right.
so they started me just on lithium, but within like 2 years, I was on 5 different medications, and it got pretty heavy pretty quickly, from just lithium to like anger management control medications, anti-anxiety medications, anti-psychotic medications.
Wow.
All kinds of different things. But it was really the time where all those things were just starting to come out too.
Right.
And so I think they were just kind of
right. And they don't
out.
work for everyone, and there's different cocktails. But wow, that's a lot to put in a growing body.
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you tell us the story about when you decided to stand up in your high school and share your truth? And just, curious, when you did that, did you lose any friends? Was it freeing? I just want to hear from you.
Yeah. So my senior year was pretty complicated. In September, I went into like a really deep depression. And then by November, I was having thoughts of suicide and death 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Wow.
And I always thought like one day I'll wake up and I'll just want to live again. So I don't really need to say anything. And I kept everything hidden. And then in January, my senior year, I was hospitalized for attempting to take my own life. And when I was hospitalized, like you kind of said in the intro, I wasn't on anyone's radar. I was president of my class and involved in every single thing possible, and had a high GPA, and had this huge external life that everybody saw, and an internal life that was completely different. So I think I thought when I got out of the hospital, like things would be pretty okay. Like people would be concerned and supportive. But when I got out of the hospital, I actually lost a couple of my close friends. And then the rumors just kind of started where, people were calling me psycho and crazy. And there were rumors about me in school. There were parents spreading rumors about me in the small town I lived in. And so one of my teachers actually thought he was helping, and he was like, you know what, I'm going to bring in a psychologist to talk about the patients he treats. And as the psychologist talked about the patients that he was treating, all the students in my classroom, even the ones that knew like that had been hospitalized, were laughing. And I don't think it was their fault. I think it was just kind of nervous laughter. I think the psychologist was a little irresponsible in the stories he was telling. And so I got really angry, and I took my teacher out into the hallway, and I said, this isn't funny to me, because I had been laughed at so much at that point. And he was really caring, and he was like, well, what do you want to do about this? And I said, well, let me speak. If they're not going to listen to all of these other people, then maybe they'll listen to me. And he said, okay. And so 2 weeks later, I stood up in that exact same classroom, and I spoke about all of my experiences for the first time.
Wow, Ross. I mean, that takes a lot of guts. I'm sure you kind of look back at your younger self with some compassion. I mean, I can't imagine, because I have teenage daughters, I would hate for them to be called names like that. Sometimes names are more hurtful than anything. And there you were, 2 weeks later, you got up and you spoke. And that was kind of probably the catalyst to lead you down this life of educating others. How did it feel to get up there and speak that first time?
I remember being really scared. I remember I sweated through my clothes and I was shaking. But one of the first things that I was trying to do was just be factual. So I really wanted people to understand what was happening and why these things are real. And I shared my brother's story, and then I kind of shared what I was going through and the development of bipolar disorder. And so I wasn't just sharing this is me and this is what I went through. I was also trying to educate people, but I was also just really angry. And the motivation for that speaking came from that kind of embarrassment of people laughing at me and making fun of me.
That's totally understandable, but, good for you for stepping into it and educating the people on the other side. And, I think that that's what we all need to do.
Yeah.
And then you began going into other high schools to discuss this, or what was the progression?
So what happened then was the same teacher kept bringing me back to the same classes. Like, he stayed a teacher at that high school. I graduated, and he thought it was really important to bring me back to speak to students. And so he brought me back for the next 5 years. And I was actually going through some of my worst times then, but he encouraged me to keep, talking about it. And then when I was 21, I had this thought about why, when I was in high school, did we have full school assemblies on, sex and alcohol and drugs, but no one ever came in and talked about mental health. And so it was around 22, I guess, when I was like, I'm going to start my own organization to create these large scale presentations about mental health. So I started my own nonprofit when I was 22. And then luckily, beyond all imagination, got hired as the director of outreach at the National Mental Health Awareness Campaign when I was 23. And so
that's incredible.
That's a pretty quick progression if you think about it.
It is a quick progression, and I think you don't give yourself enough credit. I mean, that's incredible. And also, I got teary-eyed thinking about your teacher. Teachers really can make a huge difference. And look, now you're a teacher. So cut to the Clintons and the Gores invite you. I mean, that's huge. They invite you to their first conference ever about mental illness stigma. Tell us about that.
Well, what happened was in 1999, the Clintons and the Gores had the first ever White House conference on mental health. And it was started after the Surgeon General's report identified stigma as the largest barrier preventing people from seeking help. I wasn't brought into the campaign until 2002. What they did was they were transitioning. And so they brought me in and they asked me what I thought was missing. And I was like, well, there's no large scale assemblies about mental health. And so they brought me in mainly to create those. But I did go, my very first event with the Gores was with every prominent, it was right after A Beautiful Mind came out. So it was all the stars from A Beautiful Mind and the Gores and the Surgeon General and, all these prominent mental health researchers and everybody else. And so
that's amazing, Ross. Really. I mean, you came from this small town and here you are standing shoulder to shoulder with these people that are really wanting to make a difference, and you're part of it. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it was quite a turn for my family, if you can imagine. I had just really been years out of attempting to take my own life, but I was hospitalized a couple more times after that. And so for my parents to have me go from, my dad always used to say that, he would stay up every night until he heard me come home. And there were nights where he was fully prepared that I might not make it, that, I might be driving drunk or doing something reckless and might not ever come home. And so for my parents to go from a place of truly not even believing I would live to be 21 to then getting these updates from these big events, I think it's such a huge, huge meteoric change.
Right. And pride, a sense of pride. You took your struggles and you turned it into something. But okay, so, and then after a while of this mental health curriculum, I think you got a bit burned out and you decided to join the Peace Corps, as one does.
Yeah.
And you moved to Botswana to spread awareness about HIV and AIDS, which is a total departure, obviously. That's a huge life change. So what was that like?
Well, from 2002 to 2010, I had spoken to 1 million people. I trained 50 speakers. I'd written a book. We had created the first youth mental health speakers bureau in the country and all these awareness programs. And I just couldn't keep sharing my story in the same way. And it was really hard and I needed something different. I had always wanted to volunteer abroad and live in a different country and learn a different language. And the Peace Corps was kind of a perfect match for that. What I really loved about the Peace Corps experience was that it gave me a space to really think about who I was and what I wanted, because it was so different from anything I had ever done. And, I wasn't going to be on stage anymore, and I wasn't going to be doing these big things. I was going to be much more local and much more focused and centered. And I worked at a center for people with disabilities in a pretty decent sized village in northern Botswana. So my life went from literally being in like 3 to 4 cities a week to just living in this village and cooking everything from scratch and washing my clothes by hand and doing everything back on a really basic level. And I think it was just really perfect for my mental health.
That is so amazing. I mean, my husband and I went to Bali for our honeymoon, and I remember seeing families living in like one room huts with big, big families, dirt floors. And they were so happy. And I thought, what mental illness, doesn't seem to affect these people. But the more research I've done, the more I realize that actually mental illness does. It doesn't matter your socioeconomic station in life or your gender or your age. Did you see any mental illness over in Botswana? So focused on AIDS, maybe.
No, I think what was interesting about mental health over there was the community is stronger. If you are someone who doesn't necessarily get along with everyone in your family, you can be raised by an aunt or a grandparent or someone else.
Right.
And so the community is larger and it's more connected. And so obviously there's mental health issues.
Like a safety net. They have maybe a bigger safety net. Yeah.
Yeah, obviously there's mental health issues, and I would never say there weren't. But I think that, having everything be in a spot where there's more people involved in your life, it certainly helped lessen it. Also, there's not a lot of emotional words in the tribal language that is spoken in Botswana. And so that was an interesting perspective to see of how would people express themselves if their words in their local language didn't exist.
Oh, that is so interesting. I also wonder if there's a study about like languages that have a lot of words that have to do with like sadness, if they have an increase in depression. That's an interesting thought. So you grew up in a family, as you said, where emotions were never discussed. And then now here you are back discussing them from the rooftops. And you've spoken to millions of young people. And your book and your curriculum are both called Behind Happy Faces. And I guess Behind Happy Faces is being used in a lot of different unorthodox ways. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So I think for anyone who's been hearing this whole story, my approach to mental health was different. It was, we need to get the mental health message out of the mental health field. We need to take a public health approach to it, where we start addressing people in large formats where they're not used to getting this message. And so starting that process from a really young age and kind of being able to create the mental health genre for middle schools, high schools, and colleges in the early 2000s also set up a whole different market for me when I got to develop curriculum. The thought behind the curriculum was, we've been doing awareness for a really long time, but one of the unintended effects of awareness is we keep using statistics that let people know that everyone's messed up, but we're not actually teaching them what to do about it. And if you follow other models, we didn't do that with physical health. Like, we didn't go out and tell people that they had cancer, diabetes, and heart problems, that they could die, and then just tell them to see a doctor. We actually taught them skills. So with mental health, for me, it was the same idea. Let's stop just telling people how messed up they are, and let's start giving them actual skills to manage what they're going through. And so my first partners with that curriculum were fraternities and sororities and student athletes and, middle schools, high schools as well. But I had built such a good market of other people that it was a natural fit for the curriculum. My approach to life has always been, let's see what's working and what's effective, and then let's just build something new inside that system. When I was developing mental health education curriculum, I wasn't thinking like, oh, I need to convince everyone that we need to do something new. I just followed the model for drugs and alcohol, the model for hazing, the model for sexual assault, the model for things that existed, and said, what if you use this model and you also talk about mental health?
And so, I know that now your curriculum is being used by middle schools and high schools and continuing to be used in colleges. But is there any data about the efficacy? I mean, any hard data?
Yeah, of course. There's a lot of data. The curriculum has been shown to increase help-seeking behavior. It's been shown to decrease stigma. And I think the most important thing for me is that it enhances self-efficacy. I've said from the beginning, I don't really care so much that people learn from this curriculum. I care that they apply it. And so that self-efficacy piece of being able to manage your emotions and take care of yourself and work on your skills is the most important aspect to me. And so, yeah, we have a lot of evidence-based data showing its effectiveness.
And you're also just getting that conversation started, right? And giving kids the words to use so that when they feel a certain way, they can label it, right?
Yeah.
That's really important. And I know now you are at the Geffen Academy at UCLA.
Uh-huh.
And are you like going into classrooms?
Yeah. So what happened was I was consulting at UCLA, and in 2016, the Geffen Academy at UCLA came to me and said, we're starting this school. It's going to be grades 6 through 12. What would you do if you got to start a school? And so I said, if I got to start a school, well, we would teach mental health once a week, and we would teach it in grades 6 through 12, but it would follow students every week of their entire education. It wouldn't just be a one-time thing. It wouldn't just be temporary. We would teach them about their mental health so that it followed the milestones of adolescent development and prepared them for the lives they're about to lead. And I was hired as a founding faculty member. And so what we do at the school is we do have a wellness class that meets once a week for all of our students here. So we mix wellness into every other subject as well. So you have a wellness class where you learn about your mental health once a week. And then you also learn about wellness in math, science, English, art, history, music, world languages, everything.
I love that. It's so important. And I'm sure it will become another model curriculum for other schools to incorporate like a weekly lesson. That's so great.
The goal is to replicate this system from Geffen Academy and be able to use it in schools around the country. So for me, the path was in the early 2000s, seeing that large scale assemblies didn't exist and saying like, okay, well then we need to create large scale assemblies. And then seeing in the early 2010s, okay, so now curriculum doesn't exist, and then creating the curriculum, and then eventually seeing like, okay, the education system needs to change. And so now, it's going to be slow, but we're going to work to change the education system to teach about mental health the same way you would learn about your physical health.
Well, okay, so I actually got to interview Stephen Hinshaw, which was so wonderful.
Yeah.
And he was saying how he worries about the acceptance of people about mental illness, because whereas gay marriage, the acceptance quickly that has happened was, seemingly feels sometimes overnight. With all of these school shootings and people with, these weapons going in and mass killings, he's worried that the stigma is still there. I'm curious if you think, yes, clearly I think people are talking more about mental illness, but do you think people are more accepting of someone that has a mental illness?
For all the young people that I work with, they're far more accepting than anyone that's older than them. I think that approach has to change, though. The goal should not be to isolate mental illness. It should be to normalize mental health. And the language around that is very different. If all we do is go out and educate people about all the warning signs and symptoms of the major mental health disorders in the DSM-5, then what we're unintentionally doing is teaching kids that mental health is just having a mental health disorder. And that is a failure. The actual definition of mental health isn't having a problem. It's how you address challenges in your life.
Right, because everyone has mental health.
Right. So I think that the concept of we need everyone to embrace people with mental health disorders often tends to further isolate people with mental health disorders as opposed to normalizing the concept of mental health. So I don't see this generation being closed off or not accepting of people with mental health disorders. The educational perspective and approach has to change.
What's the DSM-5?
The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, and it is what psychologists use to diagnose people with different types of mental health disorders.
Got it. I too agree with you that the younger generation is much more accepting. Where I worry about, like, for example, my own daughters and their friends, is the increased anxiety that these kids feel, like just the pressures. They're not getting out and playing. They're not, outside as much. College applications. Do you see that, or do you think it's always been like that?
I see that. That's not unreal. I think that's also coming from a place of, to be honest, I think that's coming from a place of like the digital age and it changing our brains. So I think that, with the anxiety and the depression that's on the rise, that also benefits from a solid mental health education of how to take care of yourself and the skills you need to build to combat what's happening. And I think one of the natural places for that to happen is in a school. So yeah, I see it, but I think, that's more reason for why we need to educate people.
That makes sense. And I'm sure also your curriculum talks about digital health, if that is such a word. So what would you say to a young adult who is starting their life? Maybe they're getting ready to go off to college and they have all these social, emotional, and financial pressures on them, or to anyone that's feeling hopeless?
Well, I think if you're going off to college and you have a diagnosed mental health disorder and you've been experiencing it, I think one of the most important things you can do is be prepared, be ready, have a plan when you go to college, and know that it is okay to have it set to the T, where you're like, I can talk to this counselor, I can do this, I have this person to check in with, I need these types of structures and this type of support at all times, so that, you're going in. If you were going to college in a wheelchair or on crutches, you'd have a plan. You need to have a plan for whatever you're experiencing with your mental health. I think outside of that, it's just really important to practice good habits as you get to college and make that adjustment, whether you are having a severe mental health disorder or not. I think where most college students struggle is they didn't set up a routine that keeps them balanced. And whether that is their physical health or their mental health, it's always helpful to have some kind of routine in those adjustment phases, because that adjustment phase can trigger so much anxiety or whatever mental health issue somebody is prone to experience.
I think that's really important to remember, is to have a plan before something happens, right? So to know where you can turn to and have all those kind of tools in your toolbox. And maybe just knowing that is going to be helpful to you. So we are just coming to the end of this interview. And this is what I ask all my guests. So if you could write your younger 20-year-old self, so again, maybe thinking about you back in college, a Dear Ross love letter, what would it say?
I think the most important thing that I didn't understand at age 20 was how to love myself. I went through so much of that loss and trauma from ages 11 to 12, and kind of just started blaming myself anytime something went wrong. And by age 20, developed this immense amount of self-hatred and this immense amount of just kind of defeat. And that was, I think, one of the hardest lessons I learned coming out of these experiences, was how to like myself and how to make that okay, because I lost so much in that self-hatred. And I really was lucky to survive that time period, because when you hate yourself, you just don't have consequences. You'll drive drunk, you'll do drugs, you'll have unprotected sex because you just don't care what happens to you. And that was one of the biggest things that my 20-year-old self needed.
And so what would you say to somebody that feels that hatred towards themselves?
That the process to learning how to love yourself is not quick.
Right.
That it's not something that is a switch that can just be turned on. It's a lot of deep work and a lot of support and a lot of setbacks before you're able to really find a way to like yourself, even before you can love yourself again.
Right. And I'm guessing, if you're writing yourself a love letter, you would say, keep at it because there's hope and you will get to that point if you continue to work at self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So, Ross, do you have any happiness habits, anything that you do that helps to ground you?
For me, running is critical to my mental health.
Nice.
I find that if I can find an exercise that forces me to not finish quickly, it helps my brain in a different way, because if I do exercises where I can finish quickly, then it kind of just feeds into my impulsivity and muscling through things. And I can't do long distance running quickly. And so it's just a freedom for my mind.
Oh, so you do long distance running. That's awesome. Where do you do that?
I run all over LA. I live in West Adams, so I usually run to the Culver City stairs and then run up and down.
Wow, that's a good workout. Good for you.
Quite a workout.
That's awesome. And where can the listeners find you? And I'll have all this in the show notes, but where can they find you?
The best place to find me is on my website, rosszabo.com. It's ROSSSZABO.com. That's kind of where my most up-to-date stuff is. On Instagram, it's the same, at Ross Szabo. Instagram also has @Behind Happy Faces as well, which is, social media is not something I'm great at. So bear with me if you're going to follow that account.
Well, this is so great. So again, I know I said this at the beginning, but I really am so grateful to you for using your voice to show others that mental health is something that we need to learn and teach others and know about. And it's nothing to take for granted. And I'm so happy for you that you were able to use your struggles to get to another place and help others. And thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you. I really appreciate your podcast and everything you're trying to do. We need more people talking about this. And I think it's really great that you've taken this on and are finding ways to talk about the role family plays in this and making that first, because it really, really can destroy so much of our lives when our family members are suffering, and we need more options and voices and people talking about this. So thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I do appreciate that. I really do. So anyways, I wish you lots of happiness and love and continued mental wellness.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Ross, thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
This is Rachel Steinman. For more information or to contact me with any questions, comments, or guest ideas, please check out rightnowrachel.com. That's right with a W. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, and sharing, dear family. And if you found value in what you've just heard, I would love and so appreciate a great review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I wish you love, happiness, and good mental health.